I begged him for 10 minutes not to shoot me.
Behind the horror of Columbine High School, in fact, behind every school shooting, is a story of bullied kids turning to lethal violence for revenge.
I really hated the world.
Bullying is so pervasive. It touches every school.
But not all victims of bullying turn guns on their tormentors. Some of them turn guns on themselves.
Brian said he was tired of it and he couldn't take this anymore. Brian was about a do-everything type teenager.
Bill Head is talking about his only son, Brian, who committed suicide when he was 15.
He could be off with his friends, or he could spend time by himself with his video games.
Bill and Rita Head lived with their son, Brian, in a suburb just outside Atlanta.
He was comfortable going off with my wife and I, or just with her, or just with me. And it was really quite a mix of activity that he had.
But underneath the surface, trouble was brewing. On the morning of March 25th, 1994, Brian left for Adwa High School, where he was a sophomore.
It was a routine day. Brian would always pass by his mother and tell her that he loved her, and she would tell him the same thing. It was just a common greeting that we had and the way we felt about each other.
But Brian was experiencing other emotions that day, emotions that he didn't share with his parents. Along with his usual school paraphernalia, Brian had hidden a 9mm semi-automatic pistol in his book bag. It was just before lunch in his economics class that Brian decided to act.
He stood up, he says, "I'm tired of this." He reached into his bag, pulled out a gun, and he pointed at everybody. That's whenever I was gone, then I heard the gunshot.
I got mad and just pulled the gun out, and then I ran. A few other people ran.
Responding to a frantic 911 call, Cherokee County Sheriff Roger Garrison arrived at the high school within minutes to a chaotic scene.
That one of the windows in the unit had been busted out as one of the students literally jumped out the window to escape harm, and then there next to a desk was the body of Brian Head, who had taken his own life with a 9mm handgun.
Sheriff Garrison then went to Rita Head's office and told her what had happened to her son.
At the time that Brian took his life, the word I have to use to describe my reaction, I mean, it really pales to what the emotion behind it was, just utter shock.
I'll never forget that look in her face. As soon as she saw me, she knew something had happened, and there was the obvious, the disbelief or the denial that it could actually have happened.
A co-worker of Rita's called Bill Head to tell him there had been an accident and that he needed to go to her office. That's where Bill heard what happened.
That was the most difficult moment of my life. I could not imagine why. It just seemed like it had to be a mistake.
Brian's classmates, however, knew he was troubled. Brian was overweight and wore glasses, an easy target for bullies.
He was always mad because everybody was teasing him, and one day he got really mad because in lunch one day he was wearing his glasses and someone threw an apple at him and it hit his glasses and they broke.
The universal statements from the students was that they knew why Brian took his life, that he had been bullied and harassed and that they had picked on him. All of his peers knew.
Because Brian had been bullied from the time he entered first grade.
He would have kids who would pick on him about his thick glasses or about his weight or or about the size. He was a pretty big kid. And he would bring his problems home to us and tell us about them, and then we would coach him on what he needed to do immediately at school. And in the earlier years, he would go back to school and elicit help from his teachers.
But that didn't stop the bullying. Partly, experts say, because bullying is looked on as a part of growing up. Dr. Gary McGivney is a school psychologist in Atlanta.
A long way to go, but we're trying. Part of the problem that we have run into in trying to develop an awareness of the issues and problems related to bullying is this perception in the United States that bullying is a rite of passage. I went through it when I was a kid. Every kid goes through it when they go through being a child. What's the big deal? You're overreacting.
But by the time Brian reached middle school, the teasing had changed.
Some of what had started out being just name-calling started to escalate into physical abuse. Kids sometimes would slap him in the back of the head or shove him up against the lockers, trying to get a reaction out of him, either get him to cry or, you know, cower or whatever. There were times when he was physically injured to the point of having to go to the doctor.
Because of the violent attacks, Brian did not want to go to school. In fact, an estimated 160,000 students nationwide stay home from school every day to avoid being bullied, according to the National Education Association. Brian tried to avoid the bullying, but nothing helped. After a while, he even stopped asking his teachers for help. Instead, he started retaliating. At least 3 times a year during the 8th and 9th grades, the heads were called into E.T. Booth Middle School because the school said that Brian was getting into fights with other students. But during his sophomore year, the last year of his life, the heads didn't get calls from the school. Brian told his parents that the bullying had stopped.
We found out that Brian had basically decided to stay quiet, keep it to himself.
And by keeping it to himself, he began to feel as if there was nowhere to turn. Brian shared his depression with his classmates.
Yesterday I was reading my Bible and he goes, "Do you believe in Jesus?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "How can you? Because everything goes wrong and he doesn't try helping you."
That's why there was a part of Bill Head that understood why his son chose to commit suicide.
He wanted the world to know where the source of his torture was coming from in no uncertain terms. He wanted to take his life to the place where he felt like his life had been destroyed.
In fact, Bill Head later discovered that it was a run-in with a bully that led directly to Brian's suicide.
Brian asked him to pick on someone his own size. And the boy turned around to Brian and challenged him and then slapped Brian. And that's when Brian pulled out the gun and then pointed it at the boy.
But instead of firing at the boy, Brian turned the gun on himself. And after Brian's death, the Heads discovered their son had written several poems.
I think the title of this one here describes what he would have liked to have done. It's entitled Shadows. And he says, "In the shadows, their eyes cannot stare my soul into oblivion. In the dark, I am free to move about. In the shadows, I can sleep without dreams of despair and deception. In the shadows, I am home."
Brian's decision to end the bullying by committing suicide is unusual. What has become much more common and far more alarming is for the victims of bullying to retaliate with lethal violence.